Imagine a moment of pure tension. A millionaire sees his child about to be hit by a car, and in the last second, a homeless man appears to save the child. But instead of gratitude, what he receives is contempt and humiliation. Carlos the millionaire shouts, "Don't touch my son, you're filthy," and pushes the man away with disgust. It seems like a ruthless act, doesn't it? But what happens in the following days is absolutely unexpected. Carlos, tormented by his own reaction, discovers something that will change everything he believed to be true. This story is a journey of pain, discovery, and transformation, showing how a simple act of kindness can dismantle prejudices and reveal the true essence of humanity. Get ready to be moved and surprised, because what happens next is more than a plot twist. It's a life lesson that will touch your heart and challenge your beliefs. Don't miss it. This story will make you reflect on how our actions can have a profound and unexpected impact. Check if you're already subscribed to my channel, and help me bring more stories like this. It was a sunny morning, but the city streets were bustling with activity. Cars honked impatiently, people hurried along the sidewalks, each immersed in their own routine. Carlos, a successful businessman, drove his luxury car down the main avenue, keeping an eye on the clock and the chaotic traffic. He had an important meeting and couldn't afford to be late. Next to Carlos was his son Lucas, a boy of only 6 years old, full of energy and curiosity. Lucas loved to go for rides with his father, but that day he was particularly restless. He looked out the window, observing the city's movement, when he spotted something that caught his attention: a dog playing on the other side of the street. The light was red, and Carlos's car stopped at the intersection. Seizing the momentary pause, Lucas, without considering the consequences, opened the door and ran towards the dog, ignoring his father's warning shouts. Carlos's heart nearly stopped. He shouted desperately, but the sound of cars and people drowned out his voice. At that instant, amidst the traffic chaos, a man on the sidewalk observed the scene. João, a homeless man who lived in that area, saw little Lucas running towards the street where a car was coming at high speed. Without hesitation, João dropped everything he was carrying and ran towards the boy. Time seemed to slow down as João threw himself towards the danger. He arrived just as the car was about to hit Lucas. With a quick movement, he pushed the boy out of the way, falling with him onto the sidewalk. The car passed close by, with the driver frantically trying to brake, but it was too late to avoid the impact if João hadn't acted. Lucas, scared but unharmed, looked at the man who had just saved him. His big, innocent eyes fixed on João's tired and dirty face, who was breathing heavily, still shaken by what could have happened. But before João could say anything, Carlos, in a panic, ran out of the car. When Carlos saw his son in the arms of a dirty, ragged man, his first reaction was pure instinct. He grabbed Lucas, pulling him away from João, without realizing what had really happened. "Don't touch my son. You're filthy," Carlos shouted, his voice filled with disdain and relief at the same time. João, still gasping for breath, stood still, trying to explain, but the words wouldn't come out. He just raised his hands as if to say he was only helping, but Carlos didn't want to listen. He was blinded by prejudice, unable to see the hero before him. The people around watched in silence, shocked by the scene. As Carlos returned to the car, holding Lucas tightly, João stood there, looking at the ground. He knew he had done the right thing, but the humiliation was evident. He slowly turned and began to walk away, returning to his harsh reality, as the luxury car moved away in the traffic. Little did Carlos know that this encounter, so brief and so full of misunderstandings, would change their lives in ways he could never have imagined. Carlos was still shaken after the near accident involving his son Lucas. The fear of losing the boy had taken over his body, but that fear quickly turned into another emotion: contempt. When he saw João, the man who had saved his son's life, all he could see was a filthy, poorly dressed, and smelly homeless man. Still holding Lucas, Carlos approached João, but instead of words of thanks, what came out of his mouth was a furious shout. "What do you think you're doing? Don't touch my son!" Carlos's voice echoed through the streets, cutting the air like a blade. The people around, who had been relieved by Lucas's rescue, now watched the scene with wide eyes, surprised by Carlos's aggressive reaction. João, who had still been on the ground after throwing himself to save Lucas, slowly got up. He looked at Carlos with calm but deeply sad eyes. He didn't expect a thank you, but that outburst of anger and contempt was something he didn't deserve. Still, João tried to explain. I just wanted to help, the boy was in danger. But Carlos wouldn't let him finish. Help? With your filthy appearance? You're dirty, stinky. Don't come near my son again. He said these words while moving away from João, holding Lucas tighter. To Carlos at that moment, João was not a hero but just a worthless man, someone he didn't want in his life, much less near his child. Carlos's words were like poison, each one hitting João hard. The people around began to murmur, some defending João, others simply shocked by what was happening. But Carlos was blinded, consumed by his prejudice, unable to see what truly mattered. The fact that, regardless of appearance, João had saved Lucas's life. João, who had already experienced many humiliations in his life, felt the weight of those words once again. He knew he had no right to demand anything, but still, the injustice of the situation hurt him deeply. Without saying anything more, he lowered his head and turned away, slowly walking away from the scene, returning to his harsh reality on the streets. As Carlos placed Lucas back in the car and prepared to leave, a strange sense of discomfort began to grow within him. But he ignored it, trying to justify his actions. After all, he was a concerned father. What he didn't know was that this moment of public humiliation was not the end, but only the beginning of something much larger. Something that would force him to rethink everything he believed to be true about the world and the people around him. The scene ended with João walking away, solitary, as Carlos drove off in his luxury car. Two lives that crossed by chance, leaving a deep mark. One that would forever change how Carlos saw the world. The tension in the air was palpable. The people around, who minutes before had watched in shock the near accident involving Lucas, now observed, incredulous, the scene unfolding between Carlos and João. The homeless man, still catching his breath after the heroic act, tried to explain his intentions, but the situation was far from what he had imagined. João, with heavy breathing and his heart still racing, raised his hands in a peaceful gesture, his eyes reflecting a mix of tiredness and sincerity. Sir, I just wanted to help. I saw your son running towards the car, and my only thought was to save him. His voice, hoarse and marked by years of struggle on the streets, carried undeniable honesty. He hoped his words could break the barrier Carlos had erected between them, but Carlos, still consumed by anger and prejudice, was not willing to listen. João's words were drowned out by Carlos's inner voice, which could only see the man's appearance. Dirty, ragged, unworthy of being so close to his child. Each word that came from João seemed to irritate Carlos even more, who, with a brusque gesture, raised his hand as if to push the man away. I don't want to hear your apologies. I told you not to touch my son. Carlos's voice was laden with contempt. He moved even closer to João, almost shoving him away. Do you think I'm going to let someone like you come near my family? Look at yourself. Do you think I'm a fool to believe anything you say? João took a step back, surprised and hurt by Carlos's aggression. The people around watched, some murmuring among themselves, others completely stunned by what they were witnessing. They saw a man who moments before had risked his life to save a child, now being treated as if he were the worst of criminals. But no one dared to intervene. João's expression turned sad. He knew he had no chance against Carlos's prejudice. He knew that, to that man, he would never be more than a beggar, someone without value. And that hurt deeply. Still, João was not one to hold a grudge. He looked at Lucas, who was still holding his father's hand, not quite understanding what was happening, and gave a faint smile, as if to say that everything was okay. But to Carlos, João's smile was misinterpreted as a provocation. Get out of here before I call the police, he shouted, pointing in the opposite direction, as if he wanted to sweep João out of his sight forever. And with those words, Carlos turned his back, pulling Lucas to the car, determined to leave that incident behind as quickly as possible. João stood for a moment, watching the luxury car drive away. The gratitude he had hoped for did not come, and in its place, there was only humiliation and contempt. But he held no grudge. He knew life was tough, especially for those on top like Carlos. And although Carlos's gesture had hurt him, João remembered what truly mattered. He had saved a life, and that was enough for him. As the traffic resumed its flow and people returned to their routines, João slowly turned and began walking back to the place he called home, a hidden corner under an old awning, where he could at least shield himself from the rain and the cold of the night. Each step was heavy, not just from physical exhaustion, but from the emotional weight of what had just happened. The words of contempt still echoed in his mind, and no matter how hard he tried to push them away, they pursued him. João had not been born on the streets. On the contrary, he had once had a dignified life, with a family, a stable job, and a promising future. But life, as he learned the hard way, was unpredictable and sometimes cruel. He clearly remembered how everything began to crumble. Years ago, João was a family man, married to the woman he loved, Ana, and father to a girl named Sofia, who was the light of his life. He worked as a laborer in a factory, a job that wasn't luxurious but provided for his family. They were simple but happy times. Every day, he came home tired but with a heart full of joy upon seeing his daughter's smile and his wife's affection. But the stability he had valued so much began to crumble when the factory where he worked announced massive layoffs. João was one of the first to be fired, and from that moment on, life started to take a different course. Without a job and with few opportunities, he began taking odd jobs here and there, but nothing was enough to cover the household expenses. Each passing month saw bills piling up, and the financial pressure began to create tensions in his marriage. Ana, who had always been a strong woman, tried her best to support João, but the difficulties began to affect her health. Arguments became more frequent, and João, feeling increasingly powerless, began to withdraw emotionally. He started leaving earlier to look for work and returning later, hoping to find some solution, but the streak of bad luck seemed endless. Then came the final blow. Ana fell seriously ill, and without money for proper treatment, her health deteriorated rapidly. João tried everything, sought help from friends, attempted to get loans, but nothing was sufficient. Within a few months, he lost the woman he loved and with her, a part of himself. Ana's death was the beginning of a downward spiral from which João never managed to recover. With a broken heart and destroyed finances, João lost the home he lived in. He still tried to care for Sofia, but the weight of mourning and the lack of resources led him to make a painful decision, to give custody of his daughter to her maternal grandparents, where she would at least have a chance for a better life. It was the hardest day of his life, but he knew it was the right thing to do. Now, without family, home, or hope, João ended up on the streets. The first days were the hardest. Shame and despair consumed him. He began living off small helps, a plate of food offered by a kind soul, or the few coins he could gather collecting cans. But life on the streets was not just about surviving the cold or hunger. It was also about facing the gazes of people who, like Carlos, saw him as someone dirty and worthless. As João walked back to the place where he would spend another lonely night, he remembered all of this. He remembered who he was, who he had lost, and how life had transformed him. But despite everything, he still carried within him a small flame of dignity, something that even the streets could not extinguish. João knew that people like Carlos would never understand his story, would never see beyond the dirty clothes and the smell of neglect. But that did not change who he was inside. He was a man who had loved, who had lost, and who, despite everything, still had the capacity to care about the well-being of others, as he had done by saving little Lucas. João's reality was harsh, filled with scars and losses. But it was also a story of resilience, of someone who, even when the world pushed him to the bottom, still found the strength to do the right thing. And at that moment, as he settled under the awning for another solitary night, he knew that, despite everything, there was something inside him that even the worst of days could not take away: his humanity. After that explosive encounter, Carlos returned home trying to convince himself that he had acted correctly. He entered his luxurious mansion, with its immaculate furnishings and elegant decor, but something felt different that night. Normally, upon arriving home, Carlos felt on top of the world, surrounded by the comfort that his wealth provided. But now, as he walked through the pristine corridors, an uncomfortable feeling began to grow within him, something he couldn't easily shake off. Carlos threw himself onto the leather sofa in the living room and tried to distract himself with the television, but the image of João, the beggar he had scorned, kept appearing in his mind. He remembered João's look, a look of surprise and deep sadness, not of anger or resentment but of pure pain. Carlos couldn't understand why it was bothering him so much. After all, he had acted to protect his son Lucas, hadn't he? What any parent would do. He began to recall the incident. João had run toward the car at high speed, risking his own life to save Lucas from an accident that could have been fatal. But instead of thanking him, Carlos had pushed the man away with harsh words, full of prejudice. The justification was clear in his mind. He wanted to protect his son from a stranger, someone who seemed dangerous because of his appearance. But now, in the quiet of his home, that justification seemed less convincing. Carlos got up and walked to the window, looking out at the city-lit horizon. The view that had always given him a sense of control and power now seemed empty. He tried to push away the troubling thought, rationalizing that his reaction was natural. He was just a beggar, Carlos thought to himself. I was just protecting my son. But no matter how much he tried to rationalize, the unease continued to grow inside him. He remembered the words he had used, the tone in his voice, the way he had pushed João away without even giving him a chance to speak. Carlos had always prided himself on being a just man, treating people with respect, but that scene made him question his own image. It was as if, for the first time, he was seeing a part of himself that he didn't like. And that disturbed him. He began to wonder if there was more to the situation that he was ignoring. Had he judged João too quickly because of his own insecurities? Had the fear for his son blinded him to the humanity in others? Carlos tried to push these thoughts away again, diving into his daily responsibilities. He was a busy man with important business to manage, people to command, decisions to make. But even amid meetings and commitments, the memory of João continued to haunt him. It was like a shadow he couldn't avoid. Every time he saw Lucas playing carefree, the feeling returned with even greater intensity. How could he have been so cruel to someone who deep down was just trying to help? Each day, the image of João became clearer in his mind, and Carlos began to realize that perhaps, just perhaps, he had made a mistake that he could not simply ignore. This unease was not something Carlos was accustomed to feeling. He had always been a man of quick decisions and unwavering certainties. But now, this sense of doubt began to erode his confidence. He tried to suppress it, convincing himself that he had done the right thing. But the truth was that deep down, Carlos knew there was something wrong. Something he would need to confront sooner or later. Carlos's internal conflict was the beginning of a change, a transformation he did not yet fully understand. He did not know that this unease would lead him to question much more than his actions that day, but also the way he saw the world and the people around him. And while he tried to convince himself that everything was fine, Carlos was actually at the start of a journey that would change his life forever. As the days went by, Carlos's life continued at its usual frantic pace. He was a businessman with a schedule full of appointments, meetings, and important decisions to make. However, no matter how hard he tried to immerse himself in work, there was something he simply couldn't shake off. The image of João, the beggar, running to save his son Lucas from that terrible accident. At first, Carlos tried to ignore what he felt. He repeated to himself that he had done the right thing, that protecting his son was his top priority. But as the days passed, that justification began to lose its strength. The image of João, dirty and dressed in torn clothes, risking his life to save Lucas, wouldn't leave his mind. During the long hours at work, while signing contracts or discussing strategies, the memory of that day would surface, unexpected and disturbing. Carlos found himself reliving the scene repeatedly in his head. João's desperate shout, the car's sudden braking, little Lucas being pulled away from danger, and soon after, his own cruel words laden with prejudice. Carlos began to feel a growing pain in his chest every time that memory resurfaced. He remembered the expression on João's face, a mix of surprise and sadness, when he was pushed away with disdain. At that moment, Carlos had been blinded by fear and prejudice, unable to see the reality of who João truly was. A man who, despite his own difficulties, had not hesitated to save a child's life. These thoughts began to follow Carlos everywhere, even during leisure moments. While playing with Lucas in the backyard of his mansion, he couldn't help but think of João, who was probably in some forgotten corner of the city, struggling to survive. He started to wonder how someone who had so little could be capable of such a selfless act. Carlos also began to remember other occasions in his life when prejudice had spoken louder. He wondered how many times he had judged people by their appearance, without trying to understand their stories, their struggles. And now, this specific memory of João was becoming something he could no longer ignore. What troubled him most was the lack of gratitude he had shown. Carlos knew he should have thanked João, but instead, he had let prejudice take over. He felt ashamed of how he had acted, how his words and actions had been so cruel. Each day this feeling of shame and regret grew inside him, like a seed that once planted begins to germinate and spread throughout his being. Carlos began to realize that the problem was not just in how he had treated João, but in something deeper within himself. He began questioning the values that guided him, about how he had allowed fear and prejudice to shape his reactions. This was a Carlos he did not like to see, a Carlos he did not want to be. The unease grew to the point where Carlos began to lose sleep. On nights when he should have been resting, he found himself tossing and turning in bed, unable to find peace. The memories of that day continued to haunt him, now mixed with images of other people he had treated similarly over the years. Remorse began to take hold of him in a way he had never experienced before. Over time, Carlos began to withdraw from the activities he once enjoyed. He could no longer savor the luxuries his wealth provided him, as every time he tried to distract himself, his thoughts returned to João. It was as if he was trapped in a cycle of guilt and regret that he couldn't break. Finally, Carlos began to accept that, to find the peace he so desired, he needed to do something about this feeling. The remorse he felt was not just a fleeting emotion. It was a call to action, a need to correct the mistake he had made. He knew the first step would be difficult, but he also knew that, without taking it, he would continue to be tormented by this guilt. And it was at this moment that Carlos decided he could no longer ignore what he felt. He knew he needed to find João, look into his eyes, and finally thank him and ask for forgiveness. The journey he was about to embark on would be the most important of his life. A journey not only to find a man he had scorned but to find redemption within himself. The guilt-consuming Carlos left him with no other choice. He knew he needed to understand who João was, the man he had so cruelly despised. Driven by this need, Carlos began to investigate João, determined to learn more about his life beyond the superficial image he had formed on the day of the incident. Carlos began his search discreetly. Initially, he tried asking a few people who frequented the same neighborhood where João used to stay. First, it was difficult. Most didn't know much about him, only that he was a beggar who was always around, quiet and not causing trouble. But gradually, Carlos started to piece together small fragments of the puzzle. He discovered that João was not an ordinary man. His disheveled appearance concealed a story of struggle and loss that few could imagine. João had been a dedicated worker, a family man. In earlier times he had a decent life. He worked as a mechanic in a small workshop he had opened with great effort. His wife Maria was the great love of his life, and together they had a daughter, small and full of life, named Anna. João's workshop was not large, but it was known for its honesty and quality of service. João was respected in his community, and his customers trusted him. However, as is often the case with many stories, fate took a cruel turn. The economy began to decline, and João's business felt the impact. Fewer customers, less money, more debt. The pressure began to grow, and what was once a thriving business now became a burden. To make matters worse, a personal tragedy deeply shook João. His wife Maria fell ill suddenly. A rare and aggressive disease quickly took hold of her. João, desperate, spent everything he had trying to save his wife, selling the workshop, the house, everything he owned. But even with all his efforts, Maria did not survive. Her death left João devastated and unmoored. Without his wife and workshop, João saw his life crumble. The pain of losing Maria and the guilt of not being able to save her consumed him. To make matters worse, he was unable to care for his daughter Anna as he wished. Unable to support himself and his daughter, João made the most painful decision of his life. He entrusted Anna to the care of a distant aunt, believing that she would have a better chance at a brighter future. Now, completely alone and directionless, João ended up on the streets. The cold nights and hungry days became his new reality. He wandered through the city, purposeless, haunted by memories of a life he could never get back. But even amidst this darkness, João maintained his kindness, as on the day he saved Lucas, Carlos's son. As Carlos uncovered this story, his heart ached. He began to realize that João was not merely a beggar, as he had initially thought. João was a man who had faced a series of tragic circumstances, someone who had lost everything but still carried within him a dignity and humanity that Carlos, in his prejudice, had failed to see. Carlos felt ashamed for having judged João so quickly, for having been so blind to the realities of those around him. He realized that life can be relentless, and that no one is safe from a fall. More importantly, he understood that João, despite all he had lost, was still a human being deserving of respect and compassion. This investigation brought a new perspective to Carlos's life. He could no longer see João as before, as just a beggar. Now he saw him as a man, a father who had done the impossible to save his family, and who, despite his own losses, did not hesitate to save another's life. Carlos knew he needed to do something, not just for João but for himself. He needed to correct the mistake he had made, to find a way to atone for the pain he had caused, even if it was only a small part of the wounds João carried. Carlos knew he could not ignore the guilt that consumed him. The nights became sleepless with the image of João, the man he had humiliated, invading his thoughts. He needed to do something, he needed to redeem himself. And so, on a cloudy afternoon, he decided it was time to find João. The decision to find him was not easy. Carlos was nervous, feeling a lump in his throat as he imagined what he would say. How could he apologize for something so cruel? But he knew that, no matter how difficult it was, this was the only way to find peace. Carlos went to the neighborhood where he had last seen João. He searched the streets, scanning every corner for the man who had impacted him so deeply. His heart raced, and with each step his anxiety grew. He began asking merchants and local residents about João. Some knew him, but no one knew exactly where he was at that moment. After hours of searching, Carlos finally found him in a narrow alley, where João was sitting, with his back against an old, worn wall. His eyes were closed, as if he were in a state of deep reflection or trying to disconnect from the difficulties around him. Carlos hesitated for a moment, observing the man before him. João appeared even more fragile than on the day he had saved him. The dirty, torn clothes, the face marked by time and life's adversities, all of it exuded a silent pain. With a heavy sigh, Carlos approached. The sound of his footsteps drew João's attention, who opened his eyes slowly, somewhat surprised to see that well-dressed man approaching him. João did not immediately recognize Carlos, but something in the man's gaze seemed familiar. "João, it's me, Carlos," he said, trying to keep his voice steady but unable to hide the emotion overflowing. João remained silent, waiting for Carlos to continue. The millionaire crouched in front of him, in a gesture symbolizing his attempt to place himself on the same level as the man he had scorned. "I came here to apologize. I was horrible to you that day. You saved my son, and instead of thanking you, I humiliated you. I was wrong, and I am truly sorry for that." João, who had heard so many cruel words throughout his life on the streets, was not prepared for this sudden change. He looked at Carlos carefully, trying to understand what motivated this apology, but there was sincerity in Carlos's eyes, a sincerity that could not be ignored. "There's nothing to apologize for, sir. I'm used to this sort of thing," João replied in a resigned tone, but Carlos shook his head, determined not to let the weight of his words be diminished. "No, João, that's not right. I can't accept that you think you deserve to be treated this way. No one does. I made a terrible mistake, but I want to try to make it right. I don't know how I can repair what I've done, but I'm here to listen, to learn, and to help if you'll let me." Those words, simple yet carrying immense emotional weight, broke something inside João. He wasn't used to hearing someone care about him, especially not someone like Carlos. For a moment, he felt tears threatening to surface, but he held them back. He had cried so much in his life, and tears changed nothing. But Carlos's sincerity stirred something within him, something he thought he had lost forever: his dignity. João took a deep breath, feeling for the first time in a long time that someone saw him as a human being, not just as a beggar. He was still hesitant, still cautious, but there was a glimmer of hope. "I don't know what to say," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. "But thank you for your words." Seeing Joao's vulnerability, Carlos extended his hand. "Joao, let me help you. I know I can't erase the past, but we can work together for a better future. It doesn't have to be this way. You don't have to face all this alone." Joao looked at Carlos's outstretched hand, and then at his face, trying to find any sign of deceit, but he found none. Carlos's gesture was genuine. Joao, hesitating, took Carlos's hand, and in that moment something changed. It was as if by accepting that hand he was also accepting a new chance in life. For Carlos, that simple gesture of shaking Joao's hand was a turning point. He who had always prided himself on his material achievements, realized that true wealth lay in humanity, in the ability to connect with others, regardless of their circumstances. And for Joao, this encounter was the first time in a long while that he felt seen, respected, and valued. That transformative meeting was not just about forgiveness and redemption, but also about two people from entirely different worlds coming together in a moment of shared humanity. And it was there, in that narrow and dirty alley, that both began to walk a new path, where respect and dignity spoke louder than any prejudice. After the transformative meeting between Carlos and Joao, both began to see the world with new eyes. Carlos, driven by deep shame and newfound empathy, decided that he wanted to do more than just apologize. He wanted to act to undo the pain he had caused and at the same time, provide Joao with a real opportunity. It was a sunny day when Carlos made his decision. He sat in his office, a modern and elegant room, but now it seemed a little colder and more impersonal to him. As he looked out the window, he thought about how his life had changed after that encounter with Joao. The image of the fragile yet dignified man who had been humiliated wouldn't leave his mind. He knew he needed to do something significant, something that could truly change Joao's life for the better. Carlos began to plan. He didn't want to merely offer a donation or simple financial aid. He wanted to do something deeper, something that would genuinely make a difference in Joao's life. And then he had an idea. He knew Joao had an innate talent for woodworking. Joao had revealed that before his life on the streets, he worked as a carpenter, a passion he still carried with him despite the hardships. Carlos contacted a few people and organized a special project. He decided to convert an old warehouse belonging to one of his companies into a fully equipped woodworking shop. The warehouse would be renovated, equipped with modern tools and ample space to work comfortably. More importantly, he would offer Joao a job with a fair salary, so he could return to his craft with dignity. On the day of the reveal, Carlos invited Joao to visit the warehouse. Joao was curious but had no idea what was about to happen. Carlos had meticulously prepared the surprise to ensure everything was perfect. He wanted that moment to be memorable, not only for Joao but also for himself, as a symbol of the change he had undergone. When Joao arrived at the warehouse, his expression of surprise and astonishment was immediate. The warehouse had been completely transformed. New walls, polished floors, gleaming tools, and an environment that exuded potential and hope. Joao looked around, unable to believe what he was seeing. He walked slowly through the space, touching the tools, examining the workspace, his eyes filling with tears. Carlos approached Joao and with a smile said, "This is your new workspace. From today on, this warehouse is yours, to create, build, and do what you love. And I'm here to offer you a job as a master carpenter. I want you to work here, use your skills, and regain the dignity you deserve." Joao was stunned. Emotion overcame him unexpectedly. He tried to speak, but the words seemed to escape him. Finally, he managed to express his gratitude with a simple thank you. But the look in Joao's eyes spoke much more. It was a mixture of disbelief and profound gratitude. Carlos was also moved. He had planned every detail, but seeing Joao's reaction made it all worthwhile. It was as if he was finally finding a way to redeem his mistake and make a difference in someone's life. Carlos's shocking surprise not only transformed Joao's life, but also had a profound impact on Carlos. He realized that by helping someone regain their dignity and hope, he was also rediscovering the true meaning of life and humanity. He had indeed become an agent of change, and it brought him a satisfaction that no amount of money could buy. Joao, now with a new purpose and a fresh chance at life, began to rebuild not only his career but also his self-esteem. And Carlos, with a light heart and a clear conscience, knew he had done the right thing. Through this act of generosity and empathy, Both had found a deep human connection that transformed their lives forever. The life lesson. The story of Carlos and João is a powerful testament to how the meeting of two lives can lead to profound and lasting transformation. As the sun set over the city, Carlos and João sat in João's new workspace, surrounded by tools and wood. The environment, once just a simple warehouse, was now a symbol of new hope and possibilities. Carlos looked at João, who was focused on adjusting a piece of wood, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. He realized that the true transformation had occurred within himself. The man who had once been guided by prejudice and wealth now saw the world through a lens of humility and empathy. He remembered the day he had humiliated João and how, at that time, his vision had been limited, shaped only by his position and social status. João, on the other hand, felt a silent joy. The warehouse was not just a physical space. It was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild not only his life but also his self-esteem. The dignity he thought he had lost had been restored, and the hope that had seemed to fade had returned with renewed strength. Each piece of wood he transformed seemed to carry a part of his own story of overcoming and resilience. Night fell and Carlos, determined to understand the impact of that day better, went to João's office. He had decided to share with João something that had been long stored in his heart. As they talked, Carlos spoke about his personal reflections. "João," Carlos began with a voice full of emotion, "since that day in traffic, I have thought a lot about what it really means to be human. I thought that wealth and status define who we are. But what I've learned is that it is our acts of kindness and empathy that truly define us. You showed me that even in a state of vulnerability, dignity and courage can shine with incredible intensity. I want you to know how much I have learned from you." João looked up with a grateful expression. "Carlos, I have also learned a lot from you. Your decision to change and seek the truth instead of being stuck in prejudices is something rare. I never expected to meet someone willing to correct such a big mistake, and it gives me hope for the future. I hope that as I continue my life here, I can pass on a bit of this lesson to others who are going through difficulties." Carlos smiled, a genuine and open smile, the kind that comes from the heart. The lesson we've learned is simple but powerful. We all have the power to make a difference in the lives of others. Sometimes it's just a matter of looking beyond appearances and understanding that, at the core, we are all the same. We all face challenges, and we all deserve a chance to start anew. As they spoke, both felt the connection that their stories had created. Carlos was no longer just a wealthy man with a heavy conscience. He was a man who had learned to value what truly matters in life. João was no longer just a beggar. He was a symbol of strength and renewal. Their meeting was a reminder that true wealth is not in what we possess, but in our ability to connect with others in meaningful ways. Through their journeys, Carlos and João demonstrated that human worth is something that transcends status and appearance. Humility and empathy are lessons that everyone can learn, and have the power to transform lives. As the sunset and night enveloped the city, the story of Carlos and João became a beacon of hope and a reflection on the capacity for change that each of us possesses. It was a reminder that, by opening our hearts and seeking to understand others, we can find the true essence of humanity. Life, after all, is made up of moments of connection and learning, and the meeting between Carlos and João was a shining testament to this fact. And so, the story of Carlos and João teaches us that through empathy and personal change, we can discover the true value of human connections and transform our lives in unexpected ways. This journey, marked by humility and redemption, is a powerful reminder that we all have the potential to make a difference in the world around us. If you were moved by the transformation of these two men, and believe in the power of stories that touch the heart, subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more inspiring accounts like this one. And don't forget to leave your comments below. We love to hear how these stories impact you, and want to hear your reflections. Together, we will continue to explore stories that remind us of the importance of acting with compassion and humanity. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.